So yes, as Craig said, my name is Ben Alter. I work as a policy officer in the Threat Policy and Planning team as part of the Office of the Threatened Species Commissioner within Commonwealth Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, so referred to as DECU. My team is the primary responsibility is to be the policy lead on threat abatement, including the department's implementation and review of national threat abatement planning mechanisms. So I'm here just to give a little bit of an overview of what that work exactly entails and what that might mean for something like myrtle rust. So firstly, I'd like to start, I might have skipped over. Yes, I did. Firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that we're meeting on today, Gadigal country, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to recognise the importance of First Nation people as traditional owners, custodians and law keepers of the land in the beautiful country that we're on. So our main responsibility and our main focus is the development and guiding of abatement of key threats to Australia's threatened species and ecological communities. This includes the development and regular review of threat abatement plans, which are statutory documents under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, so EPBC Act, which has been mentioned a little bit earlier on. These are developed in consultation with a variety of stakeholders from across Australia, as well as independent committee known as the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, the TSSC. They advise on plans, and our work and advice of the TSSC is then considered by the Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek, when making decisions on these plans. So the first step in the abatement process is that the threat is formally listed under the EPBC Act as a key threatening process, or a KTP. Something to note about the KTPs, these can be nominated by anybody for listing. An invitation is sent out by the Minister every year, and nominations received from that are considered by the TSSE, the Threatened Species Committee, and then open for public comment and expert comment as well. After assessment, the committee then forwards that advice to the Minister for a final decision on whether that KTP should be listed. When the Minister decides on what is listed, the EPBC Act helps provide the framework of what can be considered a KTP. A threat can be listed for three main reasons. One is that it causes a native species or ecological community to become eligible for inclusion on the threatened list. The second is it could cause an already listed threatened species or threatened ecological community to become more endangered, or it adversely affects two or more listed threatened species or ecological communities. So in total, we have 22 KTPs. This is not a complete list, obviously, of all of those KTPs. There's just a couple of examples up here. For context of where I fit in here, I am the disease man, unfortunately. Very unsexy name, but that's the second list there you see with the diseases and pathogens. So there's kind of four things primarily that fall into that. Dieback from Phytophthora, myrtle rust obviously, chytrid fungus, which is in frogs, and then beak and feather disease, which unfortunately you see in the picture down the bottom here in our native parrots. So one approach open to us is, as I mentioned, the threat abatement plan. It's a statutory document. These plans identify the research, management and other actions needed to ensure the long-term survival of native species and ecological communities affected by those KTPs. Once a KTP is listed on the Act, the Minister has 90 days to make a decision on whether a TAP should be made for that KTP. The decision is based around this core question that you see at the top here. Is it feasible, effective and efficient? And I know that's quite a hard question to answer in a lot of contexts, so a lot of work goes into answering those questions. The department, together with the Threatened Species Committee, works to provide advice to the Minister on whether that meets that criteria. The Minister then considers the advice and makes the final decision on that. If the Minister does not consider it to be feasible, effective and efficient, there are still other approaches, non-statutory approaches, beyond a TAP. So, as you can see there, threat abatement advices and national action plans. If the answer is yes, it is feasible, then we begin the drafting process of a plan. Typically, those plans are drafted by us within the department with input from both states and territories and key stakeholders. But a threat abatement plan can be made in other ways as well. So it can also be an adoption of a state plan that's been made already, if it's appropriate. Alternatively, we can make that plan jointly with states and territories where that threat occurs. So to give you an example of these other non-statutory documents, so firstly, for the statutory approaches, as you can see here in the picture, we have one for dieback currently for the TAP, but then there's also threat abatement advices. There's one of those for beak and feather disease, which you saw earlier, and then also national action plans. So one of those, the most recent one from us is the National Feral Deer Action Plan, which has just gone out for public comment recently. There's a requirement under the EPBC Act that those decisions are reviewed at regular intervals, so no longer than 5 years. The Minister can request that it's done at an earlier stage, though, if necessary. The purpose of the review is to assess the actions that have been taken towards the abatement of that threat and identify through the actions, goals and objectives of a threat abatement plan. It's an opportunity to reflect on the progress made and the challenges of abating that threat, because as we all know, threats don't stay stationary. They change as time moves forwards. So again, we question that feasibility, effectiveness and efficiency of whether or not a plan should be made. As you can imagine, it's very complex as the threat changes. So reviews should assess if the plan is feasible, effective and efficient, but also propose any revised objectives or actions, performance indicators, milestones for that threat abatement plan, and also identify any shortcomings of previous plans that were in place and content and coverage, and try and, in general terms, how those can be addressed. It provides sound justification for those proposed changes as well. So currently we're doing many different reviews of different TAPs. My side of things, Kitrid threat abatement plan is being reviewed right now, for example. And then also for implementation. It's important to remember that implementation of the threat abatement plans is done through a combined efforts of everybody. It's not simply just the governmental approach. So it's a contribution of community, government, researchers, NGOs, and also the private sector as well. It's an important factor. For the Australian government, threat abatement plans supports us in guiding our investments through administered programs. So that captures funding such as National Land Care Program, regional land partnerships, environment restoration funds, and the National Environmental Science Program. Threat abatement plans also work to support the work that we do in partnership with other areas within the department. We are a very large department in that sense. So a great example of this is the Threatened Species Action Plan, which you see at the bottom here, and the Saving Native Species Program, which is providing $224.5 million over the next 4 years to support the recovery of unique plants, animals, and ecological communities. So many of you are likely sat through all of that explanation and wondered how that applies in the context of Motorised, where that fits in. So Motorised is sitting currently under one of our KTPs known as novel Biota. This key process is intended to recognise the threat that all novel biota pose to Australian environment and highlight the vast array of different novel biota and threats posing to Australia. It goes from introduction of vertebrate species and deadly pathogens, as we mentioned, but it can vary, and ultimately all of these threaten the continued survival of our native species and ecological communities. Most of you are likely aware of the document that you see on the screen there. So in 2018, the Australian Government National Environmental Science Program supported the development of the Motorised National Action Plan, and many of the authors are here today, obviously. As mentioned earlier, these national action plans are important non-statutory approaches as well that we use to abate threats in Australia. They also offer a level of flexibility, I would say, and agility where those legislative approaches don't necessarily do that. The National Motorised Working Group was formally established in 2022 with dual purpose in mind to drive the implementation of the action plan that currently exists and to create an updated version of the National Action Plan that aligns with those legislative requirements of the threat abatement plans. So supporting a nationally coordinated approach to addressing the risks posed by myrtle rust is also one of several things within the Threat and Species Action Plan to tackle myrtle rust. The working group is one really great way that we can help to inform our TAP work for us. I want to stress that it is a two-way street, of course, but for us, from a more selfish perspective, it really helps us with our TAP work. Having that depth of knowledge in the group and that variety of perspectives gives us insight into the totality of the threat and the different ways in which it can be addressed. And I won't cover everything in this slide, obviously. I've circled a few things here that I think are very beneficial that come out of the working group, but it enables us to share that knowledge. I sat through a lot of those genetics discussions on the first day and was circling a lot of words to Google later. But that's not my job, and it's great that we can collaborate on things like that. And I can be informed by people from all different kinds of disciplines. It helps us to understand that there's tools or technologies out there that are being developed. IMAP Pests is a classic one that was example from earlier in the conference. So what's already out there, what might be possible in the future. It helps to develop better data sharing approaches. What data is important is also a really important question for us. We don't necessarily know, and that's where that knowledge within the group is very helpful. I should also mention that from a biosecurity perspective, the Australian government is taking biosecurity very seriously and has a sound understanding of the science behind the approaches to biosecurity. But inevitably, there is always some level of risk, and new strains of myrtle rust may enter Australia in the future. And these strains could have serious impact, as we've heard throughout the conference, if one does manage to get here. So early detection and identification of this would be vital. And so we need to have groups like this in place to understand that. So very quickly, I might just mention that we have two pieces of work that are major pieces of work within the group right now. Development of a myrtle rust communication strategy. As Jeff Pegg mentioned earlier in the conference, there's some amazing pieces of communications out there, like the Silent Killer video. But we need to ensure that those are reaching the right kind of people, and that people who want to do communications in the future around myrtle rust know what kind of messages and what kind of people they need to be targeting. And then secondly, as Bob also mentioned earlier on, we're working to update the National Action Plan to allow it to align with legislative requirements of a TAP. So this work is still in the early stages, but we're hoping to have a draft document later in the year that we can use for this process. In the meantime, we're currently progressing no regrets actions through the guidance of the National Action Plan, but also through the Threat and Species Action Plan, as I mentioned. So advancing our insurance collections through a stock take of myrtle rust impacted species with a view of addressing gaps in the seed bank and the germplasm collections in the future. And finally, I might just say that although I've spoken a lot today about the EPBC Act, I should note that there was a recent review, a seminal review of the EPBC Act, noting that this needs reform. And in response to that, the department has released the Nature Positive Plan, which you see here. It outlines our plan for environmental law reform. The core aim is to be nature positive, with species and ecosystems being repaired and regenerated rather than just preventing decline. It's well worth a read. I won't go into the full details of it. You can look at all of this on our website. But some key deliverables are need to protect Australia's environment from further extinction of native plants and animals, faster decision-making, and a commitment to an independent EPA that can regulate our environmental decisions. Currently, the Threat and Species Committee is working with the department in developing a new threat typology to support a more consistent approach to identification and listing of those KTPs. Precise legislative changes are coming. They're in the works and will be released for public consultation later in 2023. So in the meantime, for myrtle rust, the TSSC is working together with Queensland and New South Wales to assess and list plant species affected by myrtle rust as threatened species. Everyone will be able to have their say on these new laws and the implementation of the Nature Positive Plan. And we'll use our website to provide further information as that work progresses. So I'll just throw my contacts up here. And if you want to read either the Nature Positive Plan or the Threatened Species Action Plan, please go to our website. And my email and my team's email is there if you want to contact us. Thank you very much.